He didn't walk into the restaurant looking for her. He walked in because Fen had called in a favor, and Calder Wraith did not welch on favors. A blind date. A carefully orchestrated evening with a woman whose family name opened doors in the legitimate world. But the woman who stopped him dead wasn't sitting at the reserved table beneath the chandelier. She was kneeling in the service corridor, wringing filthy water from a rag into a steel bucket, and the bruises wringing her wrists told a story that no amount of rehearsed dinner conversation would ever touch. The mirror in Calder's private dressing room was edged in matte black steel, frameless, bolted directly into the concrete wall. It didn't flatter. It reported. The man staring back at him looked exactly like what he was. Dangerous, controlled, and completely uninterested in the evening ahead. He adjusted the collar of his black shirt, leaving the top two buttons open, not out of vanity, but because the shoulder holster sat better against bare skin. The fabric was Italian, dark enough to hide bloodstains if the night took an unexpected turn. It wouldn't be the first time. "You look like you're dressing for a funeral," Fen said from the doorway. He leaned against the steel frame, arms crossed, a crooked grin cutting across his stubbled jaw. Fen Marchetti was Calder's underboss, his closest friend, and the only man alive who could walk into his private quarters without knocking and leave with all his teeth. Tonight, Fen was also the architect of an evening Calder had agreed to under extreme duress. "It feels like a funeral," Calder replied, his voice a low, dry scrape. He pulled the holster straps tight across his ribs. The familiar weight of the 9mm settled against his chest like a second heartbeat. Fen pushed off the doorframe, walking into the room, with the easy confidence of a man who had survived 17 years in the syndicate by being smarter than he looked. He picked up the heavy silver watch from the dresser and held it out. "Odessa Hargrove is not a punishment, Calder. She's a gift. Her father controls the entire commercial real estate corridor, from the waterfront to the financial district. One dinner. 2 hours. You smile, you ask about her work, and we open a door that no amount of ammunition can kick down." Calder took the watch, strapping it to his wrist without looking at it. "I don't smile, Fen." "Then do that thing where you stare at someone, like you're deciding where to bury them." Some women find it charming. Calder didn't laugh. He hadn't laughed in a long time. Laughter required a crack in the armor, and Calder Wraith had spent the last 6 years since his father's assassination sealing every crack with concrete and discipline. He ran the Wraith Syndicate the way a surgeon ran an operating theater. Cold hands, precise instruments, no wasted movement. The empire stretched across the eastern seaboard. Ports, shipping corridors, construction contracts, and a legitimate real estate front that laundered enough capital to make the offshore accounts look like pocket change. It was inherited violence, refined into something that resembled a corporation. Calder sat at the top of it, not because he wanted to. Because the alternative was a bullet in the back of the skull from the next ambitious lieutenant who thought he could do better. He picked up the dark wool overcoat draped across the leather chair and shrugged it on. 2 hours, Calder said flatly, walking past Fen toward the door. "Not a minute more. If she asks what I do for a living, I import agricultural equipment." Fen fell into step beside him. "She already knows what you do, Calder." Her father's been briefed. "This isn't a romance. It's a handshake in a nice dress." "Then why does it need candlelight and a wine list?" "Because you can't take a woman to a shipping container and offer her an espresso from a thermos. Even if that is your preferred method of hospitality." They stepped into the elevator. Calder stared at his own reflection in the polished steel. He was 34 years old. He owned 11 properties, controlled a private army of 60 men, and had not been on a date in over 3 years. The last woman he had been involved with had been a calculated alliance that ended when her family tried to renegotiate terms with a car bomb. He had survived. The relationship had not. "This is a waste of time," Calder murmured as the elevator descended. Fen glanced at him sideways. 2 hours, boss? What's the worst that can happen?" The restaurant was called Vesper. It sat on the top floor of a converted warehouse on the harbor front, all exposed brick, blackened steel beams, and floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the dark water. Fen had reserved the corner table, the one flanked by two exits, with a clear sight line to the main entrance and the kitchen. Old habits built into dinner reservations. Calder arrived 20 minutes early. He always did. He handed his overcoat to the hostess, who smiled with professional warmth and gestured toward the private dining area. Calder nodded, but didn't follow her immediately. He stopped. The main dining room was still being prepared. Chairs inverted on tables, glassware catching the low amber light, the hum of a vacuum somewhere in the back. The floor crew was finishing the pre-service clean, a small team of workers in gray uniforms moving through the space with quiet efficiency. None of them looked up when a man in a tailored black shirt and a weapon strapped to his ribs walked through the room, except one. She was on the floor at the far end of the hallway that connected the main dining room to the private suites. A steel bucket sat beside her. A rag dark with grime was twisted between her hands. She was scrubbing the baseboard with the slow, grinding rhythm of someone who had been doing it for hours and still had hours left. Her hair was pulled back in a rough, low knot, dark auburn strands escaping against her neck. Her uniform was a size too large, the gray fabric pooling around her thin frame. She looked exhausted. Not the performative tiredness of someone fishing for sympathy, the deep, structural exhaustion of a body running on less than it needed. It was involuntary, a half-step, that broke the mechanical precision of his walk. His eyes dropped to her hands. The knuckles were raw, the skin split and red from chemical cleaners. Encircling both wrists, half hidden by the cuffs of her sleeves, were bruises, not the faded yellow-green of old injuries. These were fresh. Deep, ugly bands of purple, pressed into the skin by something that gripped hard and didn't let go. She must have felt his gaze. Because her hands went still, she looked up. Her face was angular, sharp in a way that had nothing to do with beauty, and everything to do with hunger. Her skin was pale, stretched tight over cheekbones that caught the dim light. A fading bruise sat high on her left cheekbone, the edges blending into the shadows beneath her eyes, but the eyes themselves stopped Calder cold. They were dark, almost black in the low light, and they held absolutely no fear. She looked at him the way a stray animal looks at a passing car. Not with hope, not with submission, with a flat, weary calculation that was deciding whether he was a threat worth spending energy on. She decided he wasn't. She dropped her gaze back to the baseboard and kept working. Calder stood there for 3 full seconds. In his world, 3 seconds of hesitation could cost a man his life. He was aware of it. He was aware of the hostess waiting. He was aware of Fenn's voice in his head, telling him to keep walking toward the table where Odessa Hargrove would be sitting in 20 minutes wearing something expensive, smelling like jasmine, and carrying a last name worth more than the building they were standing in. But the woman on the floor had looked at him like he was furniture, and the bruises on her wrists looked like they had a name attached to them. Calder forced himself to turn away. He followed the hostess toward the private dining area, his boots heavy on the smooth concrete. But something had shifted. A splinter had worked its way under his skin, small and sharp, and with every step he took away from her, it drove itself deeper. He didn't know her name. He didn't know why she was on the floor in a restaurant that charged $400 a plate. But the cold, controlled focus he had carried into the building was already fracturing, and the evening hadn't even started yet. The dinner was flawless on paper. Odessa Hargrove arrived exactly on time, flanked by the subtle scent of jasmine and the quiet confidence of a woman who had been groomed for rooms like this since birth. She was striking. Tall, dark-skinned, with sharp collarbones, and a silk dress, the color of wet ink that moved against her frame like water. Her handshake was firm, her smile was controlled. She sat across from Calder, crossed her ankles beneath the table, and launched into conversation with the polished ease of someone who had been briefed on exactly what to say. Calder heard her. He responded at the appropriate intervals. He asked about her work in commercial property development. He nodded when she described her father's vision for the Harbor District corridor. He held his wine glass without drinking from it, but the splinter was burrowing. Every few minutes, his gaze drifted past Odessa's shoulder toward the service passage. The amber wall sconces cast just enough light to illuminate the edge of the hallway where he had seen the woman. She wasn't there anymore. The bucket was gone. The baseboard gleamed, still damp, but Calder kept looking. "You're distracted," Odessa observed. She said it without accusation, more like a doctor noting a symptom. "Long day," Calder replied. His voice was even, but the lie sat poorly in his mouth. Odessa tilted her head. Her earrings caught the light, throwing tiny sparks across the tablecloth. "My father said you were direct. I appreciate that in a man. So let me be direct with you. This dinner is an audition for both of us. I'm not looking for a love story. I'm looking for someone who understands leverage." Calder's attention snapped back to her. For a moment, he saw a version of the evening that made strategic sense. She was smart. She was connected. Fen was right. This was a door worth opening. Then the sound hit him. It came from beyond the kitchen pass, muffled by the heavy swing doors, but sharp enough to cut through the ambient hum of the dining room. A crash. Metal against tile. And then a voice, male, low, speaking with the pressurized hiss of someone trying to yell without being heard. Calder's hand stopped on the table. His fingers went flat against the linen. Odessa was still talking. Something about council contacts and development permits. Calder wasn't listening anymore. He was reading the sound the way a man in his profession learned to read sounds. The crash had been a bucket kicked over deliberately. The voice carried the cadence of a threat, not an accident. "Excuse me," Calder said, pushing his chair back. The legs scraped against the hard floor with a sound that made Odessa's mouth close mid-sentence. He stood, buttoning his jacket with one hand, and walked toward the kitchen pass. "Calder," Odessa called after him. Her tone had shifted from polished to irritated. Calder didn't turn around. The kitchen was a wall of steam and chaos. Calder moved through the heat like a blade through smoke, past the prep tables, and through a narrow door that led to the service stairwell. The glossy veneer of the restaurant dissolved instantly. The walls were bare, cinder block. A single fluorescent tube hummed on the ceiling, casting a sick, greenish light. The air temperature dropped sharply. The stairwell smelled of mildew and old grease. The voice was louder now. It was coming from the landing one flight below. Calder descended the stairs without a sound. His hand drifted to the lapel of his jacket, fingertips brushing the grip of the 9mm. Not drawing. Not yet. Just confirming. He reached the landing and stopped. The woman from the hallway was pressed against the cinder block wall. Her back was flat against the cold surface, her chin raised, but not in defiance. In the rigid stillness of someone who had learned that fighting back made it worse. A man stood over her. He was stocky, mid-40s, wearing a manager's black shirt with the Vesper logo embroidered on the breast pocket. His left hand was clamped around her upper arm, his thick fingers digging into the fabric of her uniform hard enough to twist the cloth. In his right hand he held a mobile phone, the screen bright in the dim light. "You think you can just walk out of here?" the man said. His voice was a low, venomous rasp. "You owe Hargrove $37,000. You don't leave this building until that debt is cleared. You don't make calls. You don't talk to anyone on the floor. You clean, you serve, you shut your mouth, and you work off what your mother borrowed." Calder's blood cooled by several degrees. He felt it happen. A physical sensation, like ice water replacing the warmth in his veins. His jaw set, his breathing slowed. The part of his brain that processed empathy shut down with a clean, mechanical click, and the part that processed targets powered on. The woman's eyes were fixed on a point just past the manager's shoulder. She wasn't crying. Her expression was completely blank, a mask of absolute numbness, but her hands, hanging at her sides, were trembling. Then her gaze shifted. She looked past the man's thick shoulder. Their eyes locked for the second time that night. This time something moved behind the flat, impenetrable wall she had built around herself. Not hope. Something more dangerous. Recognition. She looked at Calder Wraith and saw exactly what he was. And she didn't look away. The manager hadn't noticed Calder. He was still talking, his grip tightening on her arm, his voice rising in pitch the way a small man's voice rose when he felt powerful. Your mother signed the contract. You inherited the debt. That's how this works, Eska. You want to run? Go ahead. I'll have someone at her bedside within the hour. You know I will. And this time, they won't just sit there. The name landed in Calder's chest, Eska. It was sharp, short, and it attached itself to the woman's face, like it had always been there. Eska didn't flinch at the threat. But her shaking hands curled into fists at her sides, and the tendons in her jaw pulled tight enough to cast shadows in the fluorescent light. Calder stepped off the landing. His boots hit the concrete with a deliberate heavy sound. Not a footstep, an announcement. The manager spun around, his hand releasing Eska's arm. His eyes went wide for a fraction of a second before the professional mask slid into place. Sir, this area is staff only. The manager started, straightening his posture, trying to reclaim authority. Calder didn't stop walking. He closed the distance in 3 measured strides and stood directly in front of the manager, close enough that the man had to tilt his chin up to maintain eye contact. Calder had 6 inches and 40 pounds on him. But it wasn't the size that made the manager take a half step backward. It was the eyes. Calder's eyes had gone completely flat, dark, still, and empty of anything resembling patience. Say that last part again, Calder said. His voice was barely above a whisper. It carried no anger, no heat. Just the terrifying, absolute calm of a man who had already decided what was going to happen and was simply giving the other person one final chance to change the arithmetic. The manager swallowed his Adam's apple, bobbed visibly. Sir, I don't know what you think you heard, but this is an internal staffing matter, and Calder placed his palm flat against the manager's chest and pushed. It was a controlled, effortless motion, but it carried enough force to send the stocky man stumbling backward until his shoulder blades hit the opposite wall. The impact knocked the phone from his grip. It clattered to the floor, the screen fracturing against the floor. The manager's face went white. I'm going to ask you 3 questions, Calder said, his voice dropping even lower. You are going to answer them clearly and without embellishment. Nod, if you understand. The manager nodded. A jerky, desperate motion. Who is Hargrove? The manager's eyes darted to Eska, then back to Calder. Desmond Hargrove. He owns the restaurant. He owns the building. He runs the manager hesitated, his tongue wetting his lips nervously. He runs the lending operation. Calder's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. Desmond Hargrove, Odessa's father. The man whose commercial real estate corridor Fenn had described as the key to legitimate expansion. The man whose daughter was sitting 20 feet above them, sipping wine and discussing development permits. The splinter drove itself straight into bone. What lending operation? Calder asked. The manager was sweating now. Small visible beads forming at his temples. He extends credit to families, immigrant families mostly, people who can't access banks, high interest. When they default, he takes collateral, labor. Their kids work it off in his properties. Restaurants, hotels, laundry services, it's all documented. Contracts, terms, everything legal on paper. Calder looked at Eska. She was still pressed against the wall, her gaze fixed on him. She hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken. But the blank mask had shifted, just a fraction, and beneath it, Calder could see the first fragile, terrified flicker of someone watching a locked door begin to open. How much does she owe? Calder asked, turning back to the manager. 37,000. Her mother borrowed it 4 years ago. Medical debt. The interest compounds monthly. The manager's voice had dropped to a pathetic, pleading mumble. I just manage the floor. I just make sure the workers stay compliant. Compliant, Calder repeated. The word tasted like rust in his mouth. He stared at the manager for a long, suffocating moment. Go back upstairs, Calder said finally. Do not speak to her again tonight. Do not speak to Hargrove about this conversation. If I find out you picked up that phone and made a call before morning, I will come back to this stairwell, and we will have a very different kind of conversation. Do you understand? The manager nodded frantically, edging sideways along the wall. He reached the stairs and scrambled upward, his shoes slapping against the steps, the sound retreating rapidly until a door slammed somewhere above and the stairs went silent. Calder stood still. The adrenaline hadn't hit him, because this wasn't adrenaline. This was the cold, clear state he entered, before a decision that couldn't be undone. He turned slowly toward Eska. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't immediately name. It wasn't gratitude, it wasn't relief. It was something harder and more complicated. The look of a woman who had learned to distrust rescue, because rescue always came with a price tag. He didn't touch her. He didn't step closer. He just stood there 4 feet away, letting the silence fill the space between them. You don't have to go back upstairs, Calder said. His voice was quiet, stripped of the lethal edge he had used on the manager. It was the closest thing to gentle he was capable of producing. Eska's dry lips parted. Her voice, when it came, was low and rough, worn thin by exhaustion and silence. Yes, I do. If I'm not on the floor in 10 minutes, he calls the people who sit with my mother. She's in a care home on Belmont. She has early onset dementia. She doesn't know where she is most of the time, but she knows when strangers sit too close. Eska's throat moved as she swallowed. They don't hurt her. They just sit there, in her room, for hours, and she gets so frightened she stops eating. Calder felt the floor shift beneath him, not physically, something structural, something foundational in the way he understood the world and his place in it. He had walked into this building to shake hands over wine glasses with a woman whose father ran a debt slavery operation. Fenn had called it a door worth opening. It was a door built on the bones of women like Eska. What's the name of the facility? Calder asked. Eska's eyes narrowed. Why? Because in about 30 minutes I am going to make a phone call, and by morning no one is going to be sitting in your mother's room who doesn't belong there. She stared at him. The distrust was still there, heavy and deeply rooted, but beneath it, something was fracturing. The same way ice fractures just before the surface gives way entirely. Maplecroft, she said quietly. Room 14. Her name is Daria Calder, committed it to memory. The way he committed a target's address. Maplecroft. Room 14. Daria. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, past the holster and pulled out a plain white business card. It had no name on it, just a phone number. He held it out to her. She didn't take it. She looked at the card, then at his face, searching for the catch. I don't know you, she said. No, Calder agreed. And the man who runs this building is about to find out that the woman he's been keeping on the floor has just become very, very expensive to touch. Eska took the card. She didn't put it in her pocket. She folded it once, slid it beneath the sole insert of her left shoe, and pressed her foot flat against the concrete. It was the gesture of someone who had learned that pockets got searched. Calder watched her do it without comment. He turned and walked back up the stairs, each step heavier than the one before, not from fatigue. From the weight of what he was about to do, the dining room had filled while he was gone. Candles flickered on linen tablecloths. The low murmur of expensive conversation hummed beneath a string quartet playing from hidden speakers. Calder moved through the warmth and the golden light, like a man walking through someone else's dream. Odessa was still at the table. She hadn't left, but her posture had changed. She was sitting straighter, her phone face down on the tablecloth, her wine glass untouched. She watched Calder approach with the focused stillness of a woman recalculating. Calder didn't sit down. He stood at the edge of the table, his hands at his sides, and looked at her. This was a productive evening. Odessa, Calder said. His voice carried no warmth and no hostility. It was the voice of a man closing a file. But I won't be pursuing the arrangement with your father. Odessa's eyes narrowed. That's an abrupt pivot. What happened in the kitchen? Nothing that concerns our dinner. Everything that happens in this building concerns my family, Mr. Wraith. My father built Vesper from a condemned lot. Whatever you think you saw downstairs, I assure you there is context you are not considering. Calder looked at her. Really looked at her. She was composed, she was intelligent, and she knew. The flicker behind her careful phrasing told him everything. She knew what the back office did. She knew about the contracts, the women cleaning floors to pay off debts their mothers had signed in desperation. She knew, and she had walked into this dinner anyway, wearing silk paid for by forced labor. There is no context, Calder said softly, that makes what I found downstairs acceptable. Odessa's expression hardened. The pleasant, strategic warmth drained from her face and something colder replaced it, something inherited. You are making a significant miscalculation. My father is not a man who tolerates insult. Walking away from this table is walking away from every legitimate channel on the eastern seaboard. I've operated without legitimate channels for 6 years. I'll manage. He reached into his pocket, pulled out 3 folded $100 notes, and set them on the tablecloth, beside her untouched wine. For the inconvenience? He turned and walked toward the exit. Odessa's voice followed him, low and laced, with a warning that sounded handed down like an heirloom. My father will hear about this before your car starts, Mr. Wraith. Calder didn't slow down. Tell him to expect my call. Fen was leaning against the black sedan parked on the harbor front, a cigarette between his lips and his phone in his hand. He saw Calder's face, and the cigarette dropped from his mouth. That was 40 minutes, Fen said. The reservation was for 2 hours. What happened? Calder opened the rear door of the sedan and paused. Desmond Hargrove is running a debt bondage operation through the restaurant. He's using immigrant families, medical debt, compounding interest, forced labor. His daughter knows. Fen's face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and then cold recognition. The legitimate channel, Fen said slowly, is a slave market with a wine list. Get in the car. Fen got in the car. Calder slid into the back seat and pulled the door shut. His phone was already in his hand. Ludo, Calder said when the line connected. Ludo Vasic was his head of security, a former military contractor who trusted no one, which was precisely why Calder trusted him absolutely. I need a team at Maplecroft Care Facility on Belmont. 2 men, plainclothes, room 14. The resident is an elderly woman named Daria. She has dementia. If anyone attempts to enter that room uninvited, detain them. Do not be gentle. Ludo didn't ask questions. Calder stared out the window at the harbor. The water was black, reflecting the city lights in broken ribbons. There's a woman in that building, Calder said. His voice had shifted. The cold command was still there, but something rawer was threading through it, something that scraped against the inside of his ribs. Her name is Eska. She's been paying off her mother's medical debt with her body and her time. Hargrove's floor manager threatened her mother's safety to keep her compliant. Fen was quiet for a long time. The sedan's engine idled. Rain began to spot the windshield. What do you want to do? Fen asked. I want Hargrove's books. Every contract, every name, every family he's trapped in that operation. And I want them before sunrise. Calder, Fen said. Carefully. Hargrove is connected. He's not a street-level operator. He has council members, judges, and port authority contacts. If we go after his books, we're not just burning a bridge, we're blowing up the entire road. Then start laying charges. The call came in at 11 minutes past 1 in the morning. Calder was in his study, a sprawling room of dark wood and aged leather. He had stripped off his jacket. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow, his forearms braced against the edge of the desk. Spread before him were the surveillance photographs Ludo's team had couriered over, Hargrove's restaurant from every angle, the back office, with its reinforced door and digital keypad, and, pinned to the corner of the corkboard behind the desk, A single grainy photograph pulled from the Vesper employee database. Eska Myron, age 26. Emergency contact listed as Daria Myron. Address listed as the restaurant itself. She lived there. She worked in the building and slept in the building because she had nowhere else to go. Hargrove had collapsed her entire existence into a single postcode he controlled. The phone rang. Calder picked it up. "Someone is requesting access at the East Gate," Ludo reported. "A woman. On foot. She gave the number from your card and asked to speak to you directly. She says her name is Eska." Calder closed his eyes. His hand tightened around the phone. "Let her in. Bring her to the study." 4 minutes later, the heavy oak door opened. Eska stood in the doorway, still wearing the oversized gray uniform. Her shoes were soaked through. Her hair had come loose from its knot. She was shaking, fine, rapid tremors running through her entire frame. Not from the cold, from adrenaline. In her right hand, pressed flat against her chest, she held a brown leather ledger the size of a hardback novel. Calder stood up slowly. "I took it from the back office," Eska said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, scraped raw by fear and determination. "He keeps the original handwritten contracts in the safe behind the filing cabinet. The combination is his daughter's birthday. I've watched him open it 200 times while I cleaned around him like I was invisible." She stepped into the room and set the ledger on the edge of his desk. Her hands were shaking so badly, the leather cover slapped against the mahogany. "There are 43 families in that book," she continued. 19 of them still have active debt. 7 of them have children working in his properties. Children, Mr. Wraith. The youngest is 14. Calder didn't touch the ledger. He looked at her. The overhead light was harsh, unforgiving. It showed everything the dim restaurant hallway had hidden. The hollows beneath her eyes were deep enough to cast their own shadows. Her cheekbones were sharp from months of inadequate food. The mark on her cheekbone was layered. Someone had been hitting her in the same spot, long enough to build a geological record of violence in her skin. "He left," she said, reading the question on his face. "The manager. After you confronted him. He drove straight to Hargrove's home. I heard him on the phone in the hallway. He told Hargrove a man at the restaurant was asking questions about the lending operation. Hargrove told him to lock down the back office and move the digital files to the secondary location in the morning." She swallowed. Her gaze held his with a ferocity that sat at complete odds with the shaking of her body. "So I took the book. Because by morning, it would be gone, and every name in those pages would have no proof they were ever trapped. I walked out the service exit, and I walked here. It took me the better part of 2 hours. I don't know this part of the city. I followed the water." Calder stared at her. This woman had been kept down, starved, bruised, and threatened for years. And in a single night, she had done what his entire intelligence network hadn't. She had walked into the predator's den, stolen the evidence, and carried it on foot through a city she didn't know, to the doorstep of a man she had met hours earlier. "You walked," Calder repeated. The word came out rough, stripped of authority, alone, at night. Eska's chin lifted. It wasn't defiance. It was the only posture she had left. "I didn't have cab fare." "Sit down," Calder said. His voice broke on the second word. He cleared his throat and pulled the heavy leather desk chair around to the front, the same way he would position a chair for someone who mattered. Eska looked at the chair. She looked at him. Then she sat, lowering herself slowly, her body rigid with the awkwardness of someone who was not used to being offered seats. Calder opened the ledger. The pages were dense with cramped handwriting, columns of names, dates, principal amounts, interest calculations, and payment records logged in labor hours. It was meticulous, obsessive bookkeeping, the kind that men kept when they wanted to prove, at least to themselves, that what they were doing was business and not cruelty. He turned the pages slowly, his jaw hardened with each one. Eska watched him read. After a long silence, she spoke. "You sat at that table tonight with his daughter." Calder didn't look up. "Yes. She was supposed to be your way in. Your alliance." "Yes. And now?" Calder closed the ledger. He rested his palm flat on the leather cover and finally raised his eyes to hers. Now, Desmond Hargrove is going to learn that the women he treated like furniture just handed his entire empire to the one man he cannot afford to have as an enemy. Calder picked up his phone. Fenn answered on the first ring. Mobilize the full detail, Calder said. Suppressed. 3 vehicles. I want Hargrove's home address, his secondary office location, and the names of every enforcer on his payroll. We move in 90 minutes. Fenn didn't hesitate. Calder hung up and turned to Eska. Your mother is safe. My men are at Maplecroft. No one is getting into that room. Eska's composure finally fractured. It didn't shatter. It cracked the way a dam cracks. A single thin line running through the surface. Just enough for a breath to escape. She pressed her raw hands flat against her thighs and exhaled a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. Something born from years of compressed terror, finding its first exit. Calder didn't move toward her. He gave her the silence to feel it. He walked to the credenza, poured a glass of water from the carafe, and set it on the desk in front of her. She drank the entire glass without stopping. When did you last eat? Calder asked. Eska set the glass down. Thursday. Calder's hand curled into a fist at his side. The knuckles went white, then slowly released. He picked up the internal phone on his desk. Mara, he said, his housekeeper, the guest suite in the East Wing. Fresh sheets and a full meal. Soup, first. Something she can keep down on an empty stomach. He hung up and looked at Eska. The walls of distrust were still there, but the edges had softened. The ice was thinning. Why are you doing this? She asked. Her voice was steadier, now, anchored by the water. You don't know me. I'm a cleaning woman who stole a book. You have no strategic reason to care about those families. Calder leaned back against the edge of the desk, his arms crossing over his chest. I walked into that restaurant tonight to open a business relationship with a man who keeps women on the floor to pay off their mother's medical bills. He paused. I didn't know, and that is not an excuse. That is an indictment. You stole that ledger because no one else was going to. You walked through the dark because every name in that book had no other advocate. You came to me because you looked at me in that corridor and made a judgment call about what I was capable of. He leaned forward slightly. You were right. Mara appeared in the doorway minutes later. She guided Eska toward the East Wing without a word. Calder watched them go, then turned back to the desk and the ledger. The Hargrove estate sat behind a high stone wall on a tree-lined avenue in the Old Money District. The residence was called Ashmore, a sprawling Georgian manor with white columns and hedgerows shaped by the same landscaping company for 30 years. A silver Bentley sat beneath the portico, gleaming under the security lights. Calder's convoy arrived at 3:47 in the morning. 3 black vehicles, engines cut, rolling the final 100 meters on momentum alone. Ludo approached the intercom. A groggy voice came through the speaker. Who is this? Open the gate, Ludo said flatly. Mr. Wraith is here to discuss a business matter with Mr. Hargrove. A long pause. Then the iron gate hummed and began to swing inward. Calder stepped out of the sedan. The night air was cold and clean. He buttoned his jacket and walked up the stone path toward the front door. Fenn flanked his right. Ludo flanked his left. 4 more men positioned themselves at the corners of the property. The front door opened before Calder reached it. Desmond Hargrove stood in the foyer wearing a burgundy silk robe over striped pajamas. He was a tall man, late 50s, with silver hair and the permanently tanned skin of someone who wintered in warmer climates. His face was composed, but his eyes were moving too quickly, flicking from Calder to Fenn to Ludo, with the rapid calculation of a man who had just realized his walls were not as high as he thought. Mr. Wraith, Hargrove said. His voice was smooth, carrying the same polished control as his daughter's. This is an unusual hour for a social call. I was told you had a pleasant dinner with Odessa this evening. Calder stepped into the foyer. The marble floor gleamed beneath a crystal chandelier that threw fractured light across the vaulted ceiling. Oil paintings lined the walls. Old hunting scenes, Inherited ancestors, the visual currency of generational respectability. It was a pleasant evening, Calder agreed, his voice carrying the terrifying calm that Fen had learned to recognize as the last sound before the architecture of someone's life collapsed. Right up until I found one of your employees being threatened in a stairwell for trying to leave a building she's been imprisoned in for 4 years. Hargrove's composure held. Barely. A muscle jumped in his jaw. I'm not sure what you've been told, Mr. Wraith, but my staffing practices are entirely legitimate. I run a social lending program for disadvantaged families. Every arrangement is documented and contractually sound. Calder reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Hargrove's eyes dropped to his hand. For a fraction of a second, genuine fear flashed across the older man's face. Calder pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Not a weapon. He unfolded it and held it up. It was a photocopied page from the ledger. It showed a woman named Darya Myran, a principal loan of $9,000, a compounding monthly interest rate of 22%, and a current balance of $37,000. Beside the financial columns, handwritten in Hargrove's own meticulous script, were the words, Daughter, Eska, assigned to Vesper floor detail, 6 days per week, 12-hour shifts, no external contact authorized. Calder let Hargrove read it. He watched the color drain from the older man's face the way water drains from a vessel with a crack in it. Slowly, then, all at once. Where did you get that? Hargrove whispered. Your cleaning woman gave it to me, Calder said. She walked through the rain to put it in my hands. She hadn't eaten since Thursday. She weighs less than my overcoat, and she has bruises on her wrists from your floor manager's fingers. Calder folded the paper and slid it back into his pocket. So here is what is going to happen, Desmond, and I want you to listen very carefully, because I am only going to say this once. Hargrove's mouth opened. Calder raised one finger. The older man's mouth closed. Every contract in that ledger is dissolved. Tonight, every outstanding balance is written to zero. Every family walks free. You will fund, from your personal accounts, a restitution payment to each family equal to the total interest they have paid over the life of their debt. Fen has a forensic accountant who will verify the numbers. If a single dollar is missing, I will know. Hargrove's face had turned a deep, mottled red. His hands were clenched into tight, shaking fists at his sides. You cannot walk into my home and dictate terms to me. I have council members who owe me favors. You are a thug with a gun and a shipping company. You have no authority here. Calder smiled. It was the first time he had smiled all night. It was a thin, cold expression that didn't touch his eyes. You're right, Calder said softly. I have no authority. What I have is the original ledger, currently being scanned onto an encrypted server. What I have is a forensic trail connecting your lending operation to 14 cases of labor exploitation involving minors. What I have is a woman willing to testify. And what I have, Desmond, is a complete lack of interest in your judges and council members. Because I don't operate in courtrooms, I operate in harbors, and your shipping contracts run through my ports. The silence in the marble foyer was absolute. If you expose that ledger, Hargrove said, his voice thin, you implicate yourself. You were here tonight to build an alliance with my family. I was here tonight on a blind date that lasted 40 minutes, Calder corrected. I have 11 witnesses, a hostess log, and a waiter, who will confirm I left before the main course arrived. You, on the other hand, have a handwritten ledger in your own penmanship, a care facility with surveillance footage of your enforcers sitting in an elderly woman's room, and a building full of workers who will talk the moment they learn they're free. Hargrove staggered backward. His hand found the edge of a marble side table and gripped it. Fen stepped forward, placing a single manila folder on the side table beside Hargrove's unsteady hand. Inside was a printed dissolution agreement. Every debt, every name, every family, zero balance, signed, witnessed, and legally binding. You have until sunrise, Calder said. After that, the ledger goes to every federal agency with a mailbox, and every journalist with a pulse. He turned and walked toward the door. Fen followed. Ludo held the door open. Calder paused on the threshold. He didn't turn around. One more thing, Desmond. Eska Myron no longer works for you. She no longer owes you. She no longer exists in your world. If I hear her name in your mouth again, or if anyone connected to you goes within a mile of Maplecroft, I will not come back here with paperwork. He stepped out into the cold night and pulled the door shut behind him. The drive back was silent. Fen sat in the passenger seat. Ludo drove. The city slid past the windows in smears of wet light. You just detonated the biggest legitimate partnership opportunity we've had in 6 years, Fen said quietly. For a woman you met tonight. Calder stared out the window. I met her on the floor, wearing bruises, like jewelry. And I was sitting across from the woman whose father put them there. Fen exhaled slowly. So what's the plan now? We rebuild the port revenue without Hargrove's corridor. And we make sure every family in that book never works off another debt they didn't choose. The sedan pulled through the iron gates of Calder's estate at 4:51 in the morning. The sky was still black, but the faintest ghost of gray was bleeding into the eastern horizon. Calder walked through the foyer, past the grandfather clock ticking steadily in the hallway, and turned toward the East Wing guest suite. The door was closed. He raised his hand and knocked twice. Soft, deliberate, a pause, then the sound of bare feet on hardwood. The lock turned. The door opened a crack. Eska's eye appeared in the gap. She scanned his face, his hands, and his shirt, looking for blood, looking for damage. The door swung open. She was wearing clothes Mara had found for her. A plain white cotton shirt, several sizes too large, and a pair of soft gray trousers rolled at the ankles. Her hair was damp from a shower. Her feet were bare on the warm hardwood. The marks on her wrists were vivid against the white cotton cuffs, but her hands were steady for the first time since he had met her. On the nightstand beside the bed sat an empty bowl. She had eaten. Calder stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded dissolution agreement. He held it out to her. Every contract is void. Every family walks free. Hargrove will fund restitution payments by the end of the week. Your mother's debt is gone. Eska took the paper. She unfolded it slowly, reading each line, with the careful, deliberate attention of a woman who had learned that promises on paper could be weapons or shields, depending on who wrote them. Her eyes moved across the text. Her lips pressed together. The paper trembled in her hands, but she held it firm. She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright, glassed over with something she was clearly fighting to keep contained. You did this in one night, she said. Her voice was barely audible. You did this in 4 years. Calder corrected. You survived long enough to hand me the weapon. I just pulled the trigger. The sentence broke something open in her chest. She pressed the paper against her sternum with both hands and exhaled a long, shuddering breath that shook her entire frame. She didn't cry. But the sound that escaped her, a thin, silent thing trapped between her teeth, was the sound of a woman setting down a weight she had been carrying for so long that her body had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright without it. Calder didn't touch her. He stood still, giving her the space to feel it, without turning it into a performance. After a long moment, Eska lowered the paper. She folded it carefully and set it on the nightstand beside the empty bowl. When she turned back to him, the guarded mask was gone. In its place was something open, unshielded, and deeply, fiercely intelligent. What happens to me now? She asked. The question wasn't helpless. She was already planning. That depends on you, Calder said. He sat on the edge of the armchair opposite the bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. You have 2 choices. I can set you up with a clean apartment, a funded account, and a new start. You walk away, no strings, no debt, no obligation to me or anyone else. Eska studied him. And the second choice? Calder held her gaze. You stole a ledger from a locked safe in a building run by a man who had dozens of families under his thumb. You walked it across the city alone at night without hesitation. You have an accountant's brain and a soldier's nerve. He paused. I don't need another person who cleans floors, Eska. I need someone who reads ledgers. The silence in the guest suite stretched out, warm and loaded. The first pale light of dawn crept through the curtains, casting a thin silver line across the hardwood floor between them. Eska's lips curved into the faintest, driest ghost of a smile. It was the first time he had seen anything close to a smile on her face. It transformed her. Beneath the bruises, beneath the hunger, beneath the weariness, there was a sharp, dark beauty that had nothing to do with symmetry and everything to do with survival. "You're offering me a job," she said. There was a flicker of disbelief in her voice. Not at the offer itself, at the absurdity of the trajectory. Hours ago, she had been on the floor with a rag. Now, a syndicate boss was sitting in an armchair asking her to read his books. "I'm offering you a seat at the table," Calder corrected. "Nobody puts you on the floor again. Nobody touches your mother. Nobody comes within arm's reach of you without answering to me, personally. But you work with me, not beneath me. Not beside a bucket, at the desk." Eska looked at her hands. The raw knuckles, the chemical burns, the fading rings on her wrists. She turned her palms over, studying them as though recognizing for the first time that they were capable of holding something other than a rag. She looked up at him. The fierce, intelligent fire in her eyes was burning steady now, no longer flickering behind a wall of survival instinct. "I have conditions," she said. Calder's eyebrows lifted. It was the closest thing to surprise she had seen on his face. "My mother stays at Maplecroft. I visit her every Sunday. No one accompanies me, no surveillance. That is my time, not yours. Done. The families. I want to see the restitution payments confirmed. Personally, every single one. If Hargrove shortchanges a single family by a single dollar, I want to know. You'll have full access to the forensic audit." Eska held his gaze. "And you never ask me to clean another floor." Something shifted in Calder's chest. A tectonic movement, like a wall built to keep the world at a distance, suddenly developing a door. He looked at this woman, hollowed out by years of cruelty, sitting in borrowed clothes, negotiating terms with a man who terrified trained killers. She was not asking for rescue. She was establishing the parameters of a partnership. He leaned forward, his hand extended across the space between them, not reaching for her offering. "Deal?" Calder said. Eska looked at his hand. She reached out and took it. Her grip was firm, despite the rawness of her skin. The contact was brief, a handshake, professional and deliberate. But when her fingers closed around his, Calder felt the tremor still running through her, the last residual vibration of a life lived in fear. And he felt the exact moment it stopped. She released his hand and sat back against the headboard. The silver dawn light was strengthening, pouring through the gap in the curtains, drawing a bright line across the bed between them. Her eyes were already sharpening, the exhaustion retreating behind the clinical focus of a mind that had been kept in a cage and was now remembering how fast it could run. "I'll need access to your accounts by Monday," she said. "And a laptop that isn't held together with tape." Calder stood up. He looked down at her, and for the first time in years, something that was not strategy, not calculation, not the cold arithmetic of power and survival, moved behind his eyes. It was quieter than that, deeper. The recognition that the most important person he would ever meet had been on the floor of a hallway. He almost walked past. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He reached out, his knuckles brushing once, lightly, against her damaged cheekbone. The touch lasted less than a second, but it carried the weight of a vow. "Welcome to the table, Eska," he said softly. She didn't flinch. She held his gaze steady as a blade, and nodded once. Calder turned and walked to the door. He paused, with his hand on the brass knob. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow, we restructure the port accounts, dismantle Hargrove's network, and find out exactly how deep his council connections go." From the bed, Her voice followed him, dry and impossibly steady for a woman who had been starving 12 hours ago. It's already tomorrow. Calder's chest hitched. A single, quiet breath of laughter. Genuine. Unfamiliar. Like a muscle he had forgotten he had. He stepped into the hallway and pulled the door shut behind him. He stood there for a moment, his forehead resting against the cool wood, his hand still on the knob. The house was silent around him. The grandfather clock ticked in the foyer. The dawn bled through the tall windows at the end of the hall, turning the marble floor to pale gold. Calder Wraith had walked into a restaurant to open a door. He had walked out of a stairwell to burn it down. And standing in the ashes, covered in someone else's survival, he had found the only person who had ever looked at him, not as a weapon, not as a transaction, not as a threat, but as a man capable of tearing down a world for a woman he had known for a single night. He didn't fall for the woman at the reserve table. He fell for the woman on the floor, with a rag in her hands and fire behind her eyes, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never knelt again. The blind date was supposed to open a door. Instead, it burned the whole building down, and the cleaning lady with the stolen ledger became the most powerful woman in the Wraith Syndicate. If you loved this dark, fierce journey and want more stories where the invisible ones turn out to hold all the cards, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this story. Tell me in the comments, what was your favorite moment of Calder's Reckoning? Thank you so much for listening. I will see you very soon for the next one.